Today we're going to talk about grants. And the one thing that I want to emphasize that I don't think the book does a good job on is how very important this is. Because really, the grants make up a big portion of how this country actually works. What happens, if you look at this little slide, is all of us pay into federal taxes, especially in income tax and business taxes and all that other stuff. But what happens is so much of those taxes, especially ones that are not earmarked for international work, those tax dollars come back to us through federal grants that come back to the states. And of course the states share some of that money with the towns and even with individuals. But this is really how it works. A little more on that in a minute. Now, I really don't care too much about how the concept of federalism has changed over the years. Your book gives you a pretty good example there. So the previous eras, I really just want you to get a feel for what's happened. In the 20th century, what has taken place is that the balance between state and federal power has clearly tipped in favor of the federal government, away from the states. Now, why has so much of the power, so much of the growth taken place in the federal government? It's really pretty simple. Because now the federal government is so involved in local and state issues. And I want you to think about this going back to the concept of federalism. What happens is the members of Congress have to remain focused on the local issues. Because if they don't, they're unlikely to be reelected. So even though they are in D.C., they are at the national level, they are focusing on state and even local, but primarily state issues. So one way to get things back to the states is through the grants. Now, in the recent times, especially since the 1960s, there has been a major change due to the growth in grants, especially in grants and aids. But what we forget is this whole idea about grants have been around since even before the Constitution, especially when land grants were given by the government to individuals and sometimes states, etc. Okay? For a while, the federal government tried loosening the strings of the categorical grants and replaced them with block grants based on formulas. Well, that didn't work too well, and this is kind of important. Some of the reasons that it did not result in more local, meaning state control of the grants, was because of something called creeping categorization. Now, what that means is that there were more and more regulations. So you saw that as they were doing this creeping, that's where my fox comes from, more and more regulations came on the block grants so that the states would do what the federal government wanted them to do. A second reason is a lot of these categorical grants actually ended up creating their own state agencies that were involved in spending these grants. And certainly interest groups were increased because they were linked to the grants. And what this did was make these state agencies and these various interest groups really depend on the grants for their very own survival. So you again kept more federal control. Now, if you look at some of these groups that came about, so think of interest groups, think of agencies that get a lot of money from a certain kind of federal grants. Well, these agencies, these groups, would talk to the congressional committees and convince them to keep the grants. Remember this for another chapter, okay? Now, we're still talking about why more local control didn't work, okay? And the third reason is because ideology changed. Liberals, Democrats, and minority groups tended to focus on national standards instead of trying to convince state government and state groups to change things. They went right after the national level and put in more regulations, etc. Where you saw conservatives, Republicans, and usually business leaders in the various states want to keep local control. Okay? Now the pendulum is swinging back. It's begun to swing back to great state authority. We saw that under President Clinton with some of the welfare changes, and we're seeing it now as some programs may be from the federal level, but the money is allowing the states to do things the way they want to do it. That's what I mean by the pendulum swinging back. Two things really kind of allowed the federal government to say, okay, let's let the states do what they want to do. And one of them was a little bit of a threat, because some states were really getting pretty fed up by the federal meddling in local affairs. One of the examples I like the best is when there was a federal grant given to Wyoming for highways, and the grant stipulated that the paint along the lines of the highways, that are on the sides of the highway, had to be white paint. Well, if you've ever driven in snow and in snow-covered roads, white paint is not a lot of help. So again, you see this frustration. Secondly, a lot of local governments, compared to even 50 years ago, are no near the level that they were before. Today, a lot of local governments, meaning state governments, are very professional. They start a number of pilot programs. They come up with some ideas and pilot those programs in their states, and then the states often even bring it in to national policy. And one of the best examples there was the 1990s welfare reform under President Clinton, when he actually listened to state governors. Now, in the court part of the chapter, I really don't care that you know the state cases that are there. Just remember that with grants, with a lot of the case law that came down about grants, most of it is based on commerce, on business, on trade, not on rights or equality. Okay? That's all you need for that part. Most of it is good old money. Now, your book talked about the years under Reagan, and we saw some politics shift where more power did go to the states. The way the grant system works, this really is how the money goes around and around and around in our country. We pay taxes, it goes to the federal government. But the majority of that money comes back to the states through grants. And what is interesting is how great a percentage federal aid, federal grant money, has become in every state budget. Why has it grown? Why have so many grants increased? Why has so much more federal money come back to the states? Well, take it from the state's point of view. The states see it as free money because they're getting money back from the federal government, but they aren't having to tax their citizens. Now, of course, the federal taxes have gone up, but we don't think of it that way. A huge reason is because we're demanding more and more of our government, and especially more and more of our federal government rather than our local. One thing to remember is why has grants grown so much also deals with intergovernmental groups. A lot of the groups that represents mayors, governors, state legislators, state employees, etc., look to the grants that come from Washington. They lobby Washington heavily to try to continue to get the money. Now, I want you to remember this when we get to the chapter on interest groups and on elections, etc. Really, this is going to be important. With a lot of things, all kinds of grants do raise a question about redistribution. After all, most of the grants have something to do with the Census Bureau, with counting the people that are involved in each state and sometimes each city and sometimes region. And what ends up happening is federal money is taken from all of us, but then redistributed back to the states, and most of the time, not on an equal basis. Some states get more than others. Now, when you think about the types of grants, I think your book does a good job on this. I'm not going to spend too much time. You see the categorical grants that usually are talking about specific purposes. They could have matching funds. Sometimes it's the feds will pay half if the state pays half. Sometimes the feds will pay 90% if the state pays half. Now, the thing I want you to think about here is if a state refuses to pay even their half, then they are also going to lose the federal half out of the budget. What that would end up meaning is the state budget really doesn't save any money at all. Kind of interesting. Now, this really is the largest area of federal grants, but they also have the most control. Your book talks about project grants based on competition and formula grants that are based strictly on math. How many people in the area determines how much money comes through. The second broad area are block grants. Now, these are a bigger purpose, and even though the feds will determine the area of purpose that the money is for, it gives the states more leeway. You see these a lot in health grants, education grants, combating crime, etc. Okay? Again, look at your textbook. There's some good examples. Here's a cute little chart. I thought this was pretty clear in giving you the basis or the differences that are in here. And it's also in your outline. Now, when you talk about grant conditions, remember that we're talking about matching funds, federal mandate. But the easiest thing is to think of the conditions, because if you're going to get money from the feds, then guess what? You're going to end up having some conditions. If you want the money, then you have to comply with the conditions. And sometimes they're very clear. But other times, some of these mandates, some of the federal conditions, even result from court decisions. So thinking back about a court decision that says that you have to desegregate, that you have to have less crowding in state prisons, that can be a pretty tough thing for states to comply with. Unfunded mandates are supposed to not have happened, but remember that when we're talking about grants in general, any of these federal grants, we often think that, well, gee, if the money comes from the feds, goes to the state government, then it is spent, by the states with state employees doing the work, etc. Well, that's not the case. In many, many grants, the money is given to private agencies. Think about charities. Think about folks who deal with addiction or some kind of disability. Those are usually private corporations. So you've got something here where federal money comes back to the state, yet goes to private citizens. Talk about something systematic. I hope this makes sense. Now, there is an overall problem, that's my second note, that I want you to remember. In most cases, if you don't pay nationally and you want the services, then you're going to have to pay at the federal level. Okay? Here's some of the functions of federal grants, just to give you an idea. Now, obviously, this is from a few years ago, but still, it puts it in perspective, I think. Here's the Department of Education budget, which has increased a great deal only in the last few years. But most of this deals with the lower grades. The intergovernmental relations today are usually cooperative federalism. The book gives you the definition. You can read it. Okay? Where the costs are shared and the administration is shared. States follow the guidelines. Here's another definition of fiscal federalism. And again, I think this is something you can take a look at. It's in the outline. With this idea of fiscal federalism, really think about all those grants and think about the grant being the way that the federal pie is divided up. There's only so many pieces, and it has to go around, and it's usually given through grants, okay? Because the grants go to the state, especially the state governments. Take a look at this little graphic, and you kind of see all the hands that are scrambling for the federal dollars. Think of those hands as individuals, as corporations, as states, especially in the federal system that we're talking about, as the states trying to get their piece of the pie. Okay? And we're looking at least $300 billion in grants every year, but that's increased. Universalism just means that the federal government is pretty careful to make sure that everybody gets at least a little something. But of course, that is part of democracy and certainly is part of federalism. When you think of the mandate blues, this just goes back to all those conditions that are based on federal spending. Now, I went through there a little quickly, but take a look at this. This gives you an idea about the money that comes from Uncle Sam to the states on a per capita basis. So if you look at this and you look at New Hampshire, you see how much money each one of us gets. Where if you look at, New Mexico, and you realize that per capita, each person in New Mexico, of course it goes to the state governments, not to the individuals, gets over $12,000 per person. And of course, we're quite a bit lower than that. That's what I mean about redistributing the federal tax dollars. Here's another example, and I think this one is really clear, about donor states. Historically, and still today, New Hampshire has always been a donor state when it comes to federal taxes. We pay in $1, but we only get back 71 cents for every dollar that we give to the feds. Now look at some of the other states, again, whether it's New Mexico or Mississippi, and they're getting back twice what they pay in federal taxes. Now, this slide is a little blurry, and I do apologize, but it is very interesting to think about which way those donor and recipient states vote. And this little red and blue thing just refers back to some of the recent elections that we've had. Something, again, I want you to think about when we get to the political parties, elections, etc., as we continue through